Hello, good evening, hello, good evening, good afternoon. I'm so used to say good evening, but it's good afternoon. Good afternoon, it's a pleasure to welcome you, all of you, to our event, Witnessing History, Understanding the Present, Learning for the Future. This event consists of two parts. One first part, which will start now at 4, and then at 6 p.m. part 2. Hopefully you can all stay for the whole program, which I will briefly introduce to you, and I hope it's not too confusing. So part 1 is a panel discussion with the title Transience, Transference, and the Dispossessed with Jane Tillman, Brigid Doherty, Tom Kohut, and myself. Part 2 is a film premiere, followed by a talk between Tom Kohut and Monica Pessler, and then an opening downstairs in the street with some drinks. Part 1 is part of a larger series of international roundtable discussions called Rooted and Displaced. And this is a collaboration between the Sigmund Freud Museum here, the Freud Foundation US, the Erikson Institute of the Austen Riggs Center, and also for one series, the Austrian Culture Forum New York. And I welcome Stephanie Buhmann as a representative from the Austrian Culture Forum New York. And part 2 is a cooperation with the Fortunov Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies of Yale University. And the whole event is part of Vienna Art Week. So there is one person guiding us through the whole event this afternoon. This is Tom Kohut. And it's a pleasure, my pleasure now to introduce Professor Kohut to all of you. So Tom Kohut is a historian and also a graduate of the Cincinnati Psychoanalytic Institute. His official title is Sue and Edgar Wachenheim III Professor of History Emeritus at Williams College, which is the second oldest institution of higher education in Massachusetts. From 2000 to 2006, Kohut served as Dean of the faculty at Williams College. He is a member of the Council of Scholars at the Erikson Institute at Austen Riggs Center in Stockbridge. He is a former Freud Fulbright Fellow, and but last not but least, he is also the president of the Freud Foundation US. He has written and published 3 books, Empathy and the Historical Understanding of the Human Past, which came out some years ago in 2020 with Routledge. Then A German Generation, an experiential history of the 20th century, which came out with Yale University Press in 2012. And then in 1991, Wilhelm II and the Germans, a study in leadership. He has also published many articles on historical and psychological topics, including the German humorist Wilhelm Busch, who was important for Freud too, as we know, then letters from German soldiers at Stalingrad, and also articles on psychohistory, history, and psychoanalysis. And currently he is in Vienna researching the experience of Austrian Jews during the Third Reich, focusing on the head of the Israelitische Kultusgemeinde Wien, Josef Löwenherz. Most importantly, he has been a close friend of the Sigmund Freud Museums for many years now. And now I will pass the word to you, Tom. And I wish us an inspiring and interesting afternoon, evening, and discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniela. So I hear myself. It's very strange not to have a microphone. So this is going to be a very long period of time, and you're going to be listening to a lot of people talking in English, so we'll try to speak slowly and clearly. A lot of what I was going to say Daniela has said already, so that's great. This is, as Daniela mentioned, the first of 3 panels on the psychological importance of place. The title of that is Rooted and Displaced, Interdisciplinary Perspectives on the Meaning of Place, which is ultimately about how and why places are important to people psychologically. The next panel, which was already mentioned by Daniela at the Austrian Cultural Forum, is about sacred places. And the last panel to be held at Riggs in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, is on place and its absence in our virtual world. What's happened to place in the virtual world that we, for better and for worse, inhabit now? So one of the things as the president of the Freud Foundation that I'm proudest of that the foundation has done is to bring the Erikson Institute of the Austen Riggs Center together with the Sigmund Freud Museum here in Vienna. And it just is so nice for me and makes me so happy that we have both the wissenschaftliche Director, scientific doesn't quite do it in English, the wissenschaftliche Director of the Sigmund Freud Museum, Daniela Finzi, and the, hold on, I'll do it, I'll get it. The Evelyn Stephenson Neff, Director of the Erikson Institute at Austen Riggs, Dr. Jane Tillman, here on the panel. And the two of them are here with Professor Brigid Doherty, who holds a position in both the German department and in the Department of Archaeology and Art. Is that right? Art and Archaeology, sorry, at Princeton University. And she was, incidentally, an Erikson scholar at Riggs a couple of years ago. And the fact is the four of us put today's panel together and indeed the whole series together. And the only thing I want to mention about the collaboration of the Erikson Institute at Riggs and the museum is that for Riggs, one of the advantages of the collaboration is that it brings publicity to this small residential, psychoanalytically oriented psychiatric hospital in rural Massachusetts, where very, very disturbed patients, so-called treatment-resistant patients, are treated with a mixture of intensive psychoanalytic psychotherapy, a patient community, and a completely open setting with no locked doors, no restrictions on movement. That goes beyond just simply that there are no locked doors. It gives a sense of the culture of the place. And there used to be other places like that, some of which you may have heard of, like Chestnut Lodge, or even more famously, the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas. Those are all gone now as psychoanalytic hospitals or mental health facilities, but Riggs is still there and going strong. And the other thing that I think is really important for the museum is that the relationship with Riggs brings attention to the fact that the clinical is an essential part of psychoanalysis. That in addition to psychoanalysis as a way of understanding culture and history and society, psychoanalysis is ultimately a form of psychological treatment, which helps people to live more fulfilled, more satisfying lives. And I think so there's a nice positivity of the relationship between the two institutions for both. Anyway, so that's all I want to say. I'm not going to make any longer introductions of the two of you or the three of you. I got one, but you're not. And let me turn the floor over now to Daniela Finzi, who will be talking about the exhibition a bit and its relation to the psychological importance of place.
Yeah, thank you, Tom, and thank you, Brigid, Jane, and Tom for this wonderful cooperation. I'm happy to start the panel now. Yeah, already when we conceived the panel discussion, it was clear that the museum's new special exhibition, Documents of Injustice, the Case of Freud, should and would provide a central starting point for our examination and exploration of loss and uprooting. And so in my contribution, I would therefore like to give you a very brief introduction of the exhibition before I focus on the importance that mostly things and objects, as we say in German, Zeugs, and in the German word there's already a hint that Zeugs has to do with Zeugen and Zeugenschaft, with testimonies, so with the importance that things and Zeugs had for the Freud family members. Before I do so, maybe some methodological remarks. I speak here as a curator and a cultural scientist, And as a curator, I would like to state the very obvious, namely that objects, things, and artifacts are central to a museum. So here at the museum, we are very aware about the fact that things are not just things. They are signifiers, they trigger ideas, associations, narratives, and memories. From a cultural studies perspective, it is maybe quite interesting to know that particularly in the German-speaking countries, there has been an increased interest in material culture since the 1990s, an interest which is of course based on the understanding that it is our interaction with objects which shapes cultural identity. Also, it is our interaction with objects which contributes to the creation and to the day-to-day maintenance of individual and also social identity. The German philosopher and sociologist Helmut Plessner speaks of a fundamental law of human natural artificiality, which means that humans are condemned to culture and are fundamentally dependent on the objects and artifacts around them. In cultural studies, there is, of course, also agreement that, especially in conjunction with immigration, objects can change their significance and undergo re-evaluation. In psychoanalytic terms, we are dealing here with a sort of Umschrift, a transcription. This is something, as we know, Freud had recognized for memories. So things from home can create a helpful bridge between immediate loss of the familiar, of property, and of future, of uncertain life situation. And this is exactly what is at stake today. So let me now start my brief introduction of the exhibition, an exhibition that has been curated by my colleague Johanna Frey and me, and that will be on display at least for 1 year. So I hope you will all have the chance to see it. Documents of Injustice, the case of Freud's, shines a light on the dispossession of Sigmund Freud and his brother Alexander, as well as the murder of their 4 sisters, Rosa, Maria, Adolfine, and Pauline, by the Nazi regime. The exhibition shows the villainy of the Nazi administration. With the eye of the world watching, the internationally renowned founder of psychoanalysis may have been able to ship to London the entire material content of Berggasse 19, complete with his collection of antiquities, but behind the scenes, he was nevertheless dispossessed of vast sums of money. His wealthy younger brother Alexander was only allowed to leave Vienna on condition that he surrendered all his belongings. By contrast, no escape could be effected for the 4 sisters who lived in Vienna. They were not only dispossessed, but in 1942 deported and murdered. The exhibition ranges across 5 sections, arranged largely chronologically and along the addresses of the family members. Berggasse and Bieberstraße are the titles of the first 2 sections. These were the addresses where Sigmund and Alexander lived, and which were no longer safe homes after the Anschluss, but sites of violent expulsion. Here at Berggasse from 1939 to 1942, 6 Sammelwohnungen, forcibly shared apartments, were installed. Bieberstraße, where Alexander with his wife Sophie and his son Harry had lived, became the new address for the sisters and also a forcibly shared apartment. This is told in section 3. Rosa, this was Freud's favorite sister, who had also lived here at Berggasse 19 between 1897 and 1906, first moved to Bieberstraße in the late summer of 1938, first of all as a kind of provisory solution. Her 3 sisters, Adolfine, Pauline, and Maria, moved in with her after the rental contract for their apartment was terminated on July 20th, 1939, in accordance with the law of tenancies with Jews, im Sinne des Gesetzes über Mietverhältnisse mit Juden. In October 1939, other Viennese Jews were forced to move in with them in Alexander's former apartment. And from the beginning of 1941, such instructions became increasingly frequent. The 4 women had to share a single room. Another 16 individuals were cooped up in the same apartment. Seegasse, Theresienstadt and Treblinka, section 4 are the addresses of the sisters' last locations. These names, these titles, these addresses also represent the fate of those who could no longer flee Nazi persecution and fell victim to the Holocaust. Yeah, and the 5th and last section on post-war Austria sheds light on the treatment of victims and perpetrators after 1945. The exhibition is based on thousands of original records, business letters, and lists, also inventory lists, from the museum's archive, predominantly compiled by the perpetrators. These documents reveal the legal and financial modus operandi of the Nazi leadership. Another major source of information are the letters, thousands of letters between family members in Vienna, in London, in New York, that have never been shared with the public before. These letters tell of the sisters' increasingly horrible living conditions in Vienna and also of the relentless efforts of the exiled family members to support them. These letters allow us to get an insight into the actions and lived experiences of the sisters, into their fears and despair, but also into their strength and dignity. Okay, so I have already briefly mentioned that our archive also contains numerous inventory lists. And as a matter of fact, recently, since our last major acquisition, a detailed list of the household contents of Berggasse 19, 14 pages long, was added. This is a central part of the exhibition. Until now, such a comprehensive list of all furnishings, including a register of Freud's antiquities, had been missing. So for us here, this is quite fantastic. And these lists are now being made available for the first time to the public. And thanks to the letters of Freud, we know how important these objects which are listed on the list, were to Freud himself. Please be aware that it was not clear from the outset that everything could be taken into exile. For weeks after their arrival in London in June 1938, the family remained anxious about the fate of their personal belongings. Quote, "We have no idea if we will get our furniture, books, etc. out," end of quote. Freud wrote in July 1938 to his brother Alexander in Switzerland. It was only once the items had actually arrived, he wrote, that he could feel Nazi-free. So here the function of the furniture takes on further significance. It represents not only home and a sense of belonging, but also freedom. And we all know that this was a strong desire of Freud to die in freedom. In August 1938, finally all the furniture, books, household goods and antiquities, more than 7,700 kilograms, packed into 3 freight cars, finally arrived in London. Over the course of September 1938, the new home in Marsfield Gardens, Hampstead, was furnished. The Freud's new home, with all the items once here downstairs, resembled their former Vienna apartment so closely that it was referred to as Berggasse. So much for Sigmund Freud's things, but what about Alexander Freud's objects? Alexander Freud, 10 years younger than Sigmund, was a very successful businessman. His company was called Allgemeiner Tarifanzeiger, an extremely renowned journal specializing in international freight traffic. Alexander was also a distinguished transportation expert. When Alexander and his wife Sophie left Vienna already in May 1938, they only had a temporary exit visa. At this time, they did not know whether or when they would return or continue their journey. So they were, in a certain sense, traveling light in May 1938. In other words, they had not or nothing prepared for emigration. Alexander and his wife ultimately moved to London in September 1938, and 2 years later they could emigrate to Toronto in Canada. On August 30, 1938, Alexander's entire in-country assets were seized by the Foreign Exchange Investigation Office, the Devisenfahndungsamt, with the exception of his home furnishings. Given the situation, it is quite understandable that the family really hoped that they might be able to save at least the furniture. Something we know thanks to the letters, especially between Alexander and his son Harry, Alexander and his sister Rosa, Alexander and his Nazi lawyer Erich Führer. On the one hand, the practical side of the furniture matter, the Möbelsache, is emphasized. Rent for furnished apartments was simply higher than for unfurnished ones. Also, Alexander was hoping that the furniture could be sold or passed on to Harry as part of his inheritance. On the other hand, we have letters that document the discomfort of starting life in a new foreign place without a single familiar object. So these letters talk about the emotional and symbolic value of the objects. Kein Buch, kein Bild, kein Möbelstück, nichts, was an die verlassene Heimat erinnert. No book, no picture, no piece of furniture, nothing to remind us of the home we left behind. What is expressed here is a kind of longing for the things themselves, a homesickness for things, as Brigid Doherty once named it. As a matter of fact, we know exactly what was confiscated, because our archives contain handwritten and also typed lists of the entire contents of the apartment, of every single drawer, of even the clothes. And secondly, we know this because we have photographs of the apartment. These photos were taken by Harry Freud, Alexander's son, who was an enthusiastic amateur photographer and always had his camera with him, be it when traveling, be it in public spaces, and even at home. Unlike Edmund Engelmann's photos of Berggasse 19, Harry's pictures even capture the kitchen, the bathrooms, and the rooms of the servants. Thanks to Rosa Graf, the sister, or maybe the maid, Nelly Gocci, these photo albums could be saved for posterity, because these albums were sent from Vienna to London. After Alexander and Sophie moved from London to Hove in September 1938, we know that the albums remained in temporary storage in London and were finally transported across the ocean with Alexander's belongings in the fall of 1940 when he emigrated to Canada. But my albums in particular would be irreplaceable to me. This is Harry writing to his father Alexander in the fall of 1939, asking him to keep the albums. What else distinguishes these letters? In fact, I did not notice any passage that explicitly express a longing for Vienna and home, but Vienna is represented in other ways, mostly as a permanent point of comparison when Alexander and Harry write about their new homes, be it places in downtown Vienna or even the city's local mountains. Und dann begegneten wir einem Eisberg, der von der Ferne mit freiem Auge besichtigt so aussah wie der alte Kahlenberg. And then we encountered one iceberg, which from a distance looked like the old Kahlenberg. Alexander wrote to his nephew Ernst Freud about his ship trip to Canada in October 1940. Of course, Viennese cuisine is also a topic. In December 1938, shortly after his arrival in New York, Harry writes in a letter to his parents that he had an excellent Bischofsbrot, just like at home, while visiting his cousin Martha Randolph, who owned Matthias Cookbook. Matthias Cookbook, and I have to tell this here, this refers to this cookbook, Das Beste aus aller Welt, 888 Rezepte einer Wiener Hausfrau, the best of everything, 888 Recipes from a Viennese Housewife, published in 1931 by Stephanie Matthias. Stephanie Matthias had moved here into Berggasse 19 in this apartment, top 7, in 1929 with her husband, a lawyer from Cologne. From early autumn 1939, 8 more people were quartered here with them in the forcibly shared apartment. Stephanie Adolf died in March 41 so she was not deported. She died before the deportation started. Her husband was taken to Theresienstadt on June 28, 1942, along with Pauline Winternitz, Adolfine Freud, and Maria Freud, so the sisters, where he died in March 43. And this brings me to the last part of my remarks, to the significance that things had for the sisters. They too had, in a certain way, lost their city, lost their Vienna, and had found themselves in a Vienna of anti-Jewish measures driven from their own homes. Especially Rosa Graf's letters, and you can see this in the exhibition as well, express this in a deeply moving way. A few days after the November pogroms, she wrote to her brother Alexander, quote, "There are only tears, hardship, and despair all around. One suffers with everyone, and no one has been spared who still has any vitality left. How fortunate we are that you are all gone. It is a miracle that one can open one's eyes again in the morning after this horror. One cannot live here if one still understands life in the way we used to." End of quote. Again, from the letters and documents, we know that all the sisters had taken some of their own furniture with them to Bieberstraße. Another quote. "I live with my furniture in your room, where a small stove that heats nicely still shows signs of your ownership, but otherwise not a single piece. Rosa can provide information about everything, as she still has some of your things in her room." End of quote. This is a letter Adolfine Dolphy wrote to her nephew Harry in January 1939. When we start to read these letters, but also from testimonies of the sisters' friends, Nelly Liebmann and Erna Patak, which have been preserved in the collection of oral history interviews and the Sigmund Freud papers, and which extracts of them you can also hear at the exhibition downstairs. So if we start to read these letters and hear the oral history interviews, we started to realize how important furnitures and objects and things were, especially to Rosa. Indeed, it was her desire to keep or hand down her favorite objects. This desire to keep the things made it possible that some of her possessions could survive the war years and the Holocaust. We know of some peculiar things, for instance, a large elephant tooth with silver clasp, but also embroideries, which were given after the war by her Viennese friends to family members in London and New York. And the Library of Congress in Washington does not only store the poems she wrote, but also countless photographs of family members that Rosa was able to bring into safekeeping before her deportation. So Rosa's practices of dealing with things may help us to understand that things, we could say, convey the memory of the material part of our existence. Things, these crutches of the material world, enable us to remember a human being, their psychological idiosyncrasies, their emotional escapades, their pasts or missteps. Rosa Graf's practices might remind us that understanding is particularly successful when there is a connection between material presence and immaterial meaning. A discarded object whose meaning, significance, or even function is unknown, or at least unclear, has lost its expressive power. It may be easier to reconstruct the past if a carrier material is available. And so I will conclude by pointing out one last item, again in our special exhibition. I'm talking about a ring that once belonged to Adolphine Freud. When Jews were forced to sell their jewelry to the Nazi regime for rock-bottom prices, Adolphine defied this order and instead gave the ring to a friend of her niece Margarete, one of her sister's Maria's daughters. A friend of Margarete, a woman called Paula Busch, who was a circus director. Busch succeeded in smuggling the ring to Copenhagen, where Margarete had been living since 1937. Then in 1943, the Danish Jewish population also fell victim to Nazi persecution. Margarete and her son Michael were hidden by a woman named Anna Westergaard, who was a politician and women's rights activist. So they were hidden by Mrs. Westergaard until the two could escape to Sweden. Margarete gave Westergaard the ring to thank her for her help, and after Westergaard's death, the ring was returned to Margarete, who gave it to her granddaughter, Barbara Freud Magnus. The ring is still today owned by the family. Barbara's daughter, Martha, owns it today, and she was the one who brought it to Vienna and put it in the display case 2 weeks ago. I will end with a quote by the Austrian-born writer Jean-Marie, who survived Auschwitz and who once wrote, "When asked how much homeland a person needs, I would say, the less they can carry with them, the more they need." Thank you for your attention.
Brigid?
Am I mic'd? There I am. First, I'd like to offer my warmest thanks to Tom Kohut for his introduction and for his part in making this event possible, to Jane Tillman for her generous collaboration here and at the Erikson Institute in 2024, and to Daniela Finzi for bringing us all here to Vienna and sharing her brilliant work at the Freud Museum with us. Also thanks to Eva Kleinschwerter for her help in bringing today's roundtable to fruition, and to Monica Pressler for her support of this event, and for all she's done here at the Freud Museum for the history of psychoanalysis in this house and far beyond. I'm going to dive right in, and I think you'll see the connections. I hope you'll see the connections to what others are saying on this panel emerge from the talk. Connections have been drawn since the mid-1960s between an evening Freud spent in conversation with the poet Rainer Maria Rilke and their mutual friend, the writer and lay analyst in training Lou Andreas Salome, at the Hotel Bayerischer Hof during a psychoanalytic conference in Munich in September 2013, and his beautiful and confounding short text of late 1915, Transience, in German, Vergänglichkeit. And you all have a copy of a photocopy of the original publication of this text on your seat. The text begins, "Not long ago, I went for a walk through a blooming summer landscape in the company of a taciturn friend and a young but already famous poet." Matthew von Unworth, for example, meditates on the possibility that the taciturn friend was Andreas Salome, and the young but already famous poet Rilke already famous poet was Rilke in his 2006 monograph, Freud's Requiem. I happen to share the doubts variously expressed by Michael Molnar and Christfried Tögl, who I think are leading a trip for the Freud Museum in the spring, regarding the identification of Andreas Salome and Rilke as real-life counterparts for those figures in Transience, whether or not they in fact took a walk with Freud in the summer of 1913 when the events in the narrative of Transience unfold. And from what I know, they most certainly did not. Molnar's proposal that we might better associate psychoanalysts Sándor Ferenczi and Karl Abraham with Freud's companions in Transience would strike me as more persuasive if I were to accept that the text describes events that in fact took place at all. Molnar is right, I think, to read Transience as involving a dialogue with Ferenczi, but I don't see Ferenczi as a character in the text's narrative. Were I to read the essay as describing a walk that in fact took place, I would be somewhat less persuaded by Turgel's recent suggestion, although it's very intriguing indeed, that the young but already famous poet might be identified as Walter Benjamin, who, as Turgel explains, like Ferenczi and Abraham, stayed in the same hotel in the Dolomites at the same time as Freud in the late summer of 1913. It's striking that, to the best of my knowledge, no interpreter of the text to date has cast Anna Freud in the role of the young poet, or for that matter, the taciturn friend, and this despite her youth, her love of poetry, and an often published photograph of Freud and his daughter out for a walk in the Dolomites in the summer of 1913. In any case, I do not read Transience in biographical terms. Rather than analyzing the text as an autobiographical narrative, I look to grasp Transience as, at its onset, a literary experiment in capturing the patterns of thought of an episode of what Freud called fantasying, Fantisierung, which is understandably but inadequately translated into English as daydreaming, which it isn't. It's something else entirely, for which we don't have a word. Fantasieren is, in this text, something akin to an interior monologue, approximating lyric fiction. In the final 2 of the 8 paragraphs that make up the roughly 1,000-word text, Transience shifts mode and recalls, on my reading, the unconscious trains of thought in a type of dream Freud described in chapter 6 of the Traumdeutung as having been made absurd because one of the elements in the dream thoughts contains the judgment, this is nonsense, and one of the dreamer's unconscious trains of thought is motivated by criticism and scorn. In the Traumdeutung, Freud notes that it is not accidental that his first examples of the absurdity of dreams should concern a dead father, most often his own. He goes on to present in detail another absurd dream, this is a famous one, once more his own, in which an acquaintance of Freud's, quote, has been attacked in an essay by no less a person than Goethe. The friend complains bitterly about it, but his reverence for Goethe has not suffered, despite his personal experience. In the dream, what Freud calls the chronological pattern strikes him as improbable. Goethe died this is Freud, Goethe died in 1832. As his attack must naturally have taken place earlier, my friend was a very young man then. It seems plausible to me that he was 18 years old, but I'm not sure what year we're in at present. And in this way, the entire calculation is plunged into darkness. The attack, by the way, is included in Goethe's well-known essay on nature, end quote. In the dream, Freud identifies with his friend, which is to say, he feels himself criticized, or he dreams himself criticized, indeed attacked by Goethe. And in the very essay that had inspired Freud to become a scientist. More on this later. There's much more to say about this extraordinary dream. Freud himself returns to it 2 more times, once more in the Traumdeutung and once more in On Dreams, which is itself somewhat unusual. For now, please just hold on to the image of Freud, confounded by what year is the present and what Goethe's age and his own might be in relation to that year. Between the interior monologue of Fantasieren and the dream thoughts that contain the critical and scornful judgment, that is nonsense, appears with reference to the young poet's experience of the blooming summer landscape. Between the Fantasieren and the dream thoughts, appears with reference to the young poet's experience of the blooming summer landscape, a 2-paragraph summary of the theory of mourning Freud had elaborated earlier in 1915 and would publish in 1917 as Mourning and Melancholia. The first words of Transience, vor einiger Zeit, not long ago, recall the beginning of a Grimm's fairy tale, vor langer Zeit, a long time ago, to effect a temporal ambiguity tinged with self-reflection, indeed, I think, with irony. Not long ago, some time ago, but when? Not long ago, this is the text in English for those of you who haven't made your way through the Fraktur. Not long ago, I went on a walk through a blooming summer landscape in the company of a taciturn friend and a young but already famous poet. The poet admired the beauty of the nature around us, but took no joy in it. He was disturbed by the thought that all this beauty was bound to fade away, that come winter it would disappear, and the same for all human beauty and everything beautiful and noble that human beings have created or could create. Everything that he would otherwise have loved and admired seemed to him devalued through the fate of transience for which it was destined. The poet then admires the beauty of the landscape in bloom, but the thought of its transience prevents him from taking pleasure in what he sees. Indeed, the disturbing thought expands and is transformed, so Freud, into what amounts to a judgment. Not only the blooming landscape, which of course would come back in the spring, or might come back in the spring, but the beauty of human beings and everything beautiful and noble that human beings could create, do create and could create, is transient. The thought of this transience, a premonition sensed in the absence of happiness, because the transience as such is not perceivable in the moment of blooming that elicits admiration, right? It's impossible that you can't see the transience. This evokes, in turn, what amounts to a reappraisal of beauty. That, in this prolepsis, now seems devalued, no longer to be admired or loved. It's a very complicated temporality and a very strange set of claims attributed first to the poet and then made by Freud himself. Freud points to an alternative to the poet's experience of a painful world weariness, a second possible emotional response, a mental rebellion against the fact of the frailty of all that is beautiful and perfect, a disavowal the text presents in free indirect discourse, in German erlebte Rede, that gives voice to someone other than the poet or the taciturn friend. No, it is not possible that all these wonders of nature and art, the inner world of our sensibilities and the world outside, should really dissolve into nothing. Freud can no more countenance that response than he can the painful world weariness of the young poet. The demand for an eternal beauty springs from a wish, and springs from a wish, Freud says, in fact, from our wish life, which sounds too weird in English, but it's fairly weird in the text as well. Springs from our wish life, then, and is incompatible with reality. In Freud's first-person narration of the scene in the blooming summer landscape, he could neither contest transience in general, nor create an exception to it for the beautiful and the perfect. But he disputed the view attributed to the pessimistic poet that the transience of the beautiful brings with it a devaluation of beauty. Once more, an exclamation breaks through in the narration. Transience yields not a decrease in the value of beauty. On the contrary, an increase in value. Transience value, Freud offers himself up as arguing in the midst of the blooming summer landscape, is scarcity value in time. That the young poet, and with him the taciturn friend, were unmoved by this economic argument for the actual value of transience and its potential yield of pleasure to be taken in beauty, Freud attributes to a clouding of their judgment by the admixture of a powerful moment of affect. Later, that is, at another unspecified time, closer to the moment of writing than the not long ago of the summertime walk as a narrated event, Freud came to believe he knew what the powerful moment of affect was. It must have been a mental revolt against mourning that devalued for them the enjoyment of beauty. The idea that all this beauty was transient gave these two sensitive souls a foretaste of the morning of its decline. And because the mind instinctively recoils from anything painful, they felt their enjoyment of beauty contracted by the thought of its transience. What the text presents as an argument between Freud in the first person and the young poet in vague, indirect discourse is, as the late Jonathan Lear put it in 2021, a shambles. Lear reads Transience brilliantly as a performance of psychic repair in the midst of world catastrophe. As much as I admire Lear's reading, and for his purposes, it's utterly persuasive, my reading differs. The poet, I think, is not only, as Lear would have it, a figment of Freud's imagination. Rather, I think, the text as a whole presents, by turns, an activity of fantasying and an imitation of dream work in its absurd form, and points to a larger structure of irony in which Freud is able, as he puts it in the interpretation of dreams, to catch the dream work in the act of intentionally fabricating an absurdity which the material itself offers no occasion for. So that's an absurdity in excess of the kind of normative absurdity of the dream, right? In which the material of the dream offers an occasion for that absurdity. These are especially absurd dreams, these dreams which have to do largely with dead fathers and the figuration of intellectual problems within dreams. So things right up Freud's alley. Only in the penultimate paragraph of Transience does Freud state when his conversation with the poet took place, right? So we're told it's not long ago, some time ago, but not until the middle of this admittedly short text are we placed in a particular year. And the year is never written down. Daniela may have something to say later about Freud and writing down years. It took place the summer before the war. 1 year later, he writes, the war broke out and robbed the world of its beauties. It not only destroyed the beauty of the landscapes through which it marched and of the works of art it struck along the way, it also shattered our pride in the achievements of our culture, our respect for so many thinkers and artists, and our hopes for the final triumph over the differences between nations and races. The present moment finds many in mourning for those beauties, achievements, and lost respect, turning from the beautiful lost objects of culture and the ideals of civilization to the idea of the nation state as the object of their love and pride. This Freud argues against, invoking the transience of mourning itself. When once the mourning is over, it will be found that our high opinion of the products of culture has not suffered under the experience of their fragility. We will rebuild anew everything that the war has destroyed, perhaps on firmer ground and more lastingly than before, end quote. That is, I think, an idea akin to an absurdity in the dream work, a place to catch Freud's essay in the act of intentionally fabricating an absurdity which the material itself offers no occasion for. And let me try to tell you why by talking a little bit about the material history of Transience as a text. Transience was written in November 1915 as an occasional essay commissioned by the Berlin Goethe-Bund for the commemorative coffee table-sized volume Das Land Goethes, which was published in both a regular and a deluxe edition in 1916. Freud's admiration for Goethe is widely known and would be hard to overstate. Any occasion to place his writing in relation to his hero was sure to arouse Freud's interest, and commentators on the essay have not failed to note that Freud's choice of topic for the volume, as much as it related to the war and to the theorization of melancholia in Mourning and Melancholia that he had developed recently but had not yet published, also alluded to themes and figures in Goethe's writing, including Alles Vergängliche ist nur ein Gleichnis, which has wide bearing on the narrative modes of Freud's text. I can't say more about that here. And that is, of course, from the concluding lines of the mystical chorus at the end of Faust II. Freud might also have been inclined to accept the invitation to contribute to Das Land Goethes because the Goethe-Bund had its origins in a turn-of-the-century campaign against German state censorship. As Peter Gallison has shown, censorship was much on Freud's mind in 1915, both as a practical matter inhibiting the dissemination of his work and of his letters, and in a parallel relation to that public political fact of wartime life as a central concept in his account of dreams and wishes in psychic life. However one views the complex of motivations for its publication, Freud's contribution to Das Land Goethes stands out thematically, tonally, and stylistically within a book that bears the nationalistic subtitle Ein Vaterländisches Gedenkbuch. Let me say a few more words about the volume in which Transience first appeared and the occasion of its republication during Freud's lifetime that pertain to the topic of our roundtable today. Das Land Goethes proclaimed a practical aim to raise funds for the restoration of East Prussian properties, Heimstätte, destroyed in the early months of World War I, as well as a cultural one, quote, to present a parade, a Heerschau, of the intellectual and moral leadership of contemporary Germany. The final line of the book's foreword further asserts that the volume amounts to a declaration of loyalty to the German Geisteswelt in word, tone, and image, a testimonial to the unshakable belief in the victory of the German sword and the German soul. Freud's writings related to the war in the months leading up to his acceptance of the invitation to contribute to Das Land Goethes, Death and Us, Wir und der Tod, first delivered as a lecture in February 1915 and published a few weeks later, and Thoughts for the Times on War and Death, written in March and April, do not speak to an unshakable belief in the victory of the German sword and the German soul, but to the disillusionment with which the war has evoked and the altered attitude towards death which it forces upon us, as Freud put it. That the war by winter 1915 had become a source of disillusionment betrays the enthusiasm that Freud, like so many others, had felt at its outset. And disillusionment should not be mistaken for opposition. Disillusionment as a psychological state and a moral problem intertwines with an altered attitude towards death in Freud's writings of 1915, including Transience. The circumstances of the war reveal themselves to be something other than what they seemed, while mortality freshly defies disavowal. The matter for Freud was urgent. In 1915, 2 of his 3 sons were both soldiers, Martin on the Russian front and Ernst in Galicia. Their father's fears for them occupied his waking thoughts and his dreams alike. When reprinted in the Almanach der Psychoanalyse for 1927, ahead of its appearance among the Vermischte Schriften in the 11th volume of Freud's collected writings in 1928, Transience followed a series of tributes to Freud offered on the occasion of his 70th birthday, which is 6 May 1926. Tributes by Lou Andreas Salome, Ernst Bleuler, Stefan Zweig, and Alfred Döblin, and a reproduction of Ferdinand Schmutzer's 1926 portrait of Freud. Transience was introduced as a sketch, and mention was made of the charitable aims of the volume in which it originally appeared, identified there as the construction of public libraries in East Prussia, but not of the project's larger, specifically patriotic and nationalistic cultural aims. In both the 1927 Almanach and the 1928 Gesammelte Schriften, Transience appeared alongside another occasional essay on schoolboy psychology, which was published in 1914 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Gymnasium Freud had attended in Vienna. Freud's description of the psychology of the schoolboy holds no surprises. It centers on a complex of transferential relations to the men who serve as his schoolmasters and to the father from whom the boy begins to detach himself during those years, no longer seeing the father as the mightiest, wisest, and richest of beings. The schoolboy takes his schoolmasters as substitute fathers and brings to those relationships in turn an ambivalence first felt for the father. Far more interesting than the description of schoolboy psychology are the text's reflections on its own origins, which redound upon the origins of Freud's, of a wish of Freud's that he put into words in an essay composed for his Matura. Quote, "A wish that I might, during the course of my life, contribute something to our human knowledge." Of course, Freud had been asked to contribute to the celebration of the anniversary of his Gymnasium, because by 1914, he had indeed contributed something to human knowledge. Schoolboy psychology opens with the conceit that the text itself had been composed as the fulfillment of a school assignment, specifically an assignment to write a German essay, einen deutschen Aufsatz schreiben. That is, an essay in the study of German language and literature. You have a strange feeling, Freud writes, if late in life you are ordered once again to write a German essay. It is strange how readily you obey the orders as though nothing in particular had happened in the last half-century. But in fact, you have grown old in the interval. You are on the eve of your 60th birthday, and your physical feelings as well as your mirror show unmistakably how far your life's candle is burnt down. As little as 10 years earlier, Freud notes, he had experienced, quote, moments in which he suddenly felt quite young again. As, for example, while walking the streets of Vienna, quote, "The present time seemed to sink into obscurity, and the years between 10 and 18 would rise from the corners of my memory, with all their guesses and illusions, their painful distortions and heartening successes." Reflecting on that time of his life in the moment of writing this new German essay, Freud notes, "I seem to remember that through the whole of this time, that is of schoolboy time, through the whole of this time there ran a premonition of a task ahead, an Ahnung einer Aufgabe, until in my school-leaving essay, I was able to find words to express that premonition. I wished in my life to contribute something to our human knowledge." In writing Schoolboy Psychology, not only recollections of schoolboy experiences, but a kind of resuscitation of his own schoolboy psychology emerged again for Freud from the corners of his memory, as it had done earlier in everyday life, making him feel suddenly young again. Now that resuscitation of schoolboy psychology was to be registered on the page, where his writing would appear once more as a German essay. At the same time, Freud mourned that, approaching 60, he no longer experienced the resuscitation of his schoolboy psychology as a feeling of sudden youngness emerging from the corners of his memory as he walked the streets of Vienna. The psychology he put down on the page was a psychology of guesses and illusions and ambivalent paternal transferences. It was also, vitally, a psychology involving a premonition of what he would seek to do in the course of his future life, put in words in his school-leaving German essay as an ambition to contribute to human knowledge. Schoolboy Psychology, at once an ironical German essay and a tender lament, looks back to a time in Freud's life when, amidst all the guesses and illusions and ambivalent paternal transferences of adolescence, the premonition of his future calling was awaiting transformation by means of writing into an ambition and a wish, which is to say, a premonition was awaiting transformation in the medium of the German essay into the mental entity whose reconceptualization would form the basis of psychoanalysis. Schoolboy psychology finds Freud in 1914 once again clothing a premonition in the words of the German essay, rendering it a wish. The wish, as Freud first noted at age 17, and as he would repeat in his Selbstdarstellung of 1924, was a wish to become a scientist. And that wish had been aroused by his hearing an essay on nature that was attributed to the young Goethe, read aloud in a public lecture in Vienna during his final months as a schoolboy. The German essay he composed on the topic of considerations in the choice of profession for his school-leaving examinations in 1873 earned Freud the highest mark in his class. As he wrote to a friend at the time, quote, "My professor told me that I had what Herder so eloquently calls an idiotic style. That is a style at once correct and characteristic. I was duly taken aback at this amazing fact and hastened to spread the news of this happy event abroad and as far and wide as possible, the first of its kind," end quote. This recognition as a German stylist in command of an idiotic style seems to have called up another wish in Freud. Alongside the wish to make a contribution to human knowledge that was expressed in his consideration of the choice of profession, which had their origins in his admiration for Goethe's, for an essay on nature that he understood to have been written by Goethe in his youth. This second wish was a wish for the occasion of the Matura, not to be the last time he would gain that recognition for his excellence and his stylistic idiosyncrasy in composing a German essay. Freud counseled his friend to preserve his letters, bind them together, guard them well, you never know. His advice was taken, and the letter, along with others of the period, came to light in the 1930s. The now famous Matura-Brief was published posthumously in 1941. Both wishes that figure in that letter, the wish to make a contribution to human knowledge and the wish to be recognized as a certain kind of stylist of German prose, remained active and arguably inseparable throughout Freud's life. The words in which he clothed those wishes in the early years of the First World War registered a fresh ambivalence concerning what it meant to write a German essay, and effected in Transience an ironical intensification of his idiotic style. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. It's an honor to speak here in Vienna at the Sigmund Freud Museum. And I thank Daniela Finzi and Monica and Tom Kohut and the Sigmund Freud Museum for past and future collaboration with the Erikson Institute of the Austen Riggs Center, and Brigid Doherty, former Erikson scholar, for her work bringing Princeton into a future collaboration. My remarks this afternoon grow out of conversations about the museum's current exhibit, Documents of Injustice, the Case of Freud. The exhibit illuminates the powerful losses incurred by the Freud family: loss of life, loss of material possessions and wealth, and loss of place. These losses occurred within the context of human destructiveness and perverse ideals involving a fantasy of purity of place. The exhibit's moral and historical weight led me to reflect on how psychoanalysis has long been aware of the importance of place and of the significance of loss of place, yet has rarely treated place as an analytic concept in its own right. Today, I want to explore what I call transference to place, the unconscious displacement of early relational experience onto geography, setting, and environment. This transference is not simply an attachment to place or nostalgia, although such experiences may be included in the transference configuration. Transference to place includes the repetition of psychic themes of safety, loss, and belonging, enacted through our relation to the physical and cultural worlds we inhabit. When we begin to recognize this form of transference, both in our patients and in ourselves, the field of psychoanalysis widens to include the various places, natural, historical, and institutional, that hold and shape our psychic lives. In psychoanalytic theory, we are accustomed to using spatial metaphors to describe psychic life. We speak of transitional space, potential space, inner space, negative space, suggesting various regions of psychic activity, but these remain largely abstract. What has been less explored is place, the concrete and material environments that hold meaning for us. Freud was certainly aware of the psychic power of place. In his 1936 letter to Romain Rolland on the occasion of Rolland's 70th birthday, titled in the standard edition, A Disturbance of Memory on the Acropolis, Freud describes a memory from years before while traveling with his brother to Athens for the first time and standing on the ancient ruins of the Acropolis, and suddenly being seized by a disbelief that such a place that he had only read about in school really existed. He recalls that moment of estrangement or dissociation in a way that demonstrates how the external world can evoke unconscious conflicts about one's right to be somewhere or to belong. His mixture of awe and alienation suggests that an encounter with a powerful place can awaken unconscious or disavowed feelings of gratitude, guilt, or even being in a forbidden place. Freud traced his reaction to an unconscious conflict related to his father, and the sense that Freud had gone further than his father ever could. This realization evoked guilt as well as pride. Here, the landscape of the Acropolis became the stage for an inner drama of inheritance and felt transgression, and maybe triumph. In this vignette, we can see that the meaning of place is never purely external. Standing on the Acropolis, Freud experienced the intersection of physical reality of place with a psychic reality where personal history, cultural identity, and unconscious fantasy all converged. Diane O'Donoghue, in her 2019 book, noted Freud's fascination with sites such as the Acropolis and Rome show how deeply his imagination was rooted in the material world of architecture, artifacts, and history. For Freud, place was not neutral, but it was a surface on which psychic life could be formed through both introjection and projection. The American psychoanalyst Harold Searles, in his book from 1960, The Non-Human Environment, took this insight further, defining the non-human environment as the human relationship to animals, nature, and things. For Searles, the non-human environment was essential in healthy human development to establish a sense of continuity, grounding, and self-cohesion. The non-human environment participates in the analytic situation alongside the analyst, becoming woven into the transference as objects of emotional investment. What Searles observed clinically, the American writer Eudora Welty captured artistically. In her essay, Place in Fiction, she writes this: place is one of the lesser angels that watch over the racing hand of fiction. Perhaps the one that gazes benignly enough off from one side, while others, like character, plot, symbolic meaning, and so on, are doing a good deal of wing beating about her chair. And feeling, who in my eyes carries the crown, soars the highest of them all, and rightly relegates place into the shade. I believe the same is true for analysis. Psychic development and life do not unfold in abstraction. Rather, psychic life lives somewhere, and it is shaped by the physical, material, and cultural environments we inhabit, in addition to our early relationships with caretakers and people. The reciprocity between people and the environment is captured by the poet Wendell Berry when he writes, quote, "The world is no better than its places. Its places, at last, are no better than their people, while their people continue in them." Berry reminds us that people and places are intimately connected and shape one another. When a culture wounds its land or becomes a place of disconnection or alienation, psychic life suffers as well. At the Austen Riggs Center where I work, treatment occurs in a living environment, a therapeutic community, and in a singular place. Founded in 1919 and shaped into a psychoanalytic hospital by Robert Knight, who arrived as the medical director in 1947, Riggs is situated in rural New England, with its buildings, gardens, and the natural beauty of the Berkshires forming a physical holding environment. Located on Main Street in the small town of Stockbridge, it becomes clear that this particular place and town are part of what makes our fully open setting possible. Our patients often arrive with a sense of alienation, both literally and psychically. They are often in transition as in their lives, as young people trying to leave home and find a place in the world, or middle-aged and older adults who are in other life transitions, divorce, loss, retirement, that leave them with a changed connection to their places. They come seeking a treatment and a sense of belonging in our therapeutic community, and the physical place of Riggs and Stockbridge become part of that process. I think of one patient who said, "This place feels like it is holding me until I can hold myself." That statement captures the essence of transference to place. The patient experienced the institution itself, the staff, the routines, the grounds, the town, as a containing place. Over time, we explored how this developmental need for a holding environment, both concrete and symbolic, expressed earlier unmet needs. When we listen to the emotional meaning of a patient's relationship to the setting, whether idealized, devalued, feared, or confused, we often uncover deeper layers of experience. The analytic work then involves helping the patient notice how their feelings and experience of the current place may link to unconscious patterns of attachment and loss. In this way, the analytic environment becomes part of the transference field. The patient's feeling about my office, whether it's too hot or too cold, its proximity to their living environment, its safety, become entwined with their transference feelings towards me as the analyst. Attending to these meanings of place and environment in the here and now, understanding that they may hold meanings from the past, potentially deepen the work of psychoanalysis. The Austen Riggs Center shares a connection to Vienna, not only through our psychoanalytic foundation, but through Erik and Joan Erikson. Erich Hamburger arrived in Vienna as a young man in 1927 and taught at the Hietzing School and was analyzed by Anna Freud here in this building. Attending the Wednesday evening meetings of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society and training in child analysis, Erikson was admitted to full membership in the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society in 1933. He came with his wife Joan to the United States in 1934 and was on the staff of the Austen Riggs Center from 1951 to 1960. Both Freud and Erikson underwent exile and forced migration, one as an older man at the end of his life, and the other a young man just embarking on his career as a psychoanalyst. Freud's forced exile from Vienna in 1938 was both geographic and psychic loss of the place he had lived for nearly 8 decades. In a letter to Max Eidingen written shortly after arriving in London, Freud described his ambivalence, quote, "The feeling of triumph at being freed is too strongly mingled with grief, since I have always loved the prison from which I have been released." This sentence captures the paradox of exile, the simultaneous experience of escaping persecution and the mourning that comes with such a necessity. Erikson, leaving Vienna in 1933, renamed himself after arriving in the United States, changing his name from Erich Hamburger to Erik Erikson, a symbolic act of self-creation. His lifelong work on identity reflected his personal history of dislocation and the attempt to create a self in relation to place. Former Fulbright Freud scholar at the Sigmund Freud Museum, Vamik Volkan, a psychoanalyst and Turkish Cypriot, also immigrated to the United States and has spent the better part of his career as a psychoanalyst, extending Erikson's theories of individual identity to understanding how identity and place operate at the level of the collective. In his work on chosen trauma, Volkan describes how large groups link their sense of identity to the memory of shared catastrophes, often involving the loss of a homeland. Through stories, rituals, and myths, the grief of the group becomes woven into cultural identity and transmitted across generations. In Volkan's work, transference to place becomes a collective phenomena. The past and its losses and humiliations are reactivated and projected into the present, animating political and emotional life. This mourning process can bind a community for generations until grievance becomes grief, or at times leads to efforts to reclaim what has been lost through negotiation, or when that fails, through war and aggression. In these examples of exile, forced migration, and the effects on individual and collective identity, loss of place is not merely geographic, it is psychic. These experiences become the field of transference, linking generations, shaping imagination, and binding the past to the present in powerful, often unconscious repetitions. In addition to Volkan's work, Marianne Hirsch's idea of post-memory helps explain how the transmission of loss of place occurs. Post-memory refers to the relationship of later generations to the traumas of their ancestors. Traumatic events in which the current generation has not concretely experienced may continue to shape psychic life. When trauma has involved the loss of place, what is inherited is not only the suffering, but the absence of a world, of a language, of property, in a landscape that once grounded identity. Descendants of people who have endured forced migration may long for places they have never seen, or feel guilt for having a type of stability and safety when those in previous generations did not. In analysis, we may become curious when we meet patients who cannot seem to settle anywhere, or move restlessly from one place to another, or who dream of returning and finding a home that feels authentic. These may not be only individual conflicts, but in some patients echo the experience of intergenerational displacement. Listening for how these longings and conflicts enter the analytic conversation allows patients to begin to symbolize that which has been unconsciously lodged in them. Inherited losses can be imagined, symbolized, and mourned, and at times expressed in the awakening of creative forms such as art and literature. Before COVID sent so many analytic endeavors online, the place of the analyst office provided a specific type of holding environment that some patients could use in important and creative ways. Transferences to the office were a part of the work. With virtual treatments, we still have so much to learn about virtual space and how it does or does not create a sense of place and belonging with another person. For patients at Riggs, the material place remains an important ingredient of the treatment because we offer a total experience of community, shared meals, belonging, and in-person treatment creating a very particular kind of place. A variety of transference moments become integral parts of the treatment, not only as backdrop, but occasionally as foreground that hold meaning and memory. The concept of transference to place highlights something implicit in psychoanalysis. Psychic life is never placeless. We live and dream in relation to our physical environment. When that place is lost through exile, migration, or catastrophe, our sense of continuity may falter. Freud's disturbance of memory on the Acropolis, one he recalls over 30 years after visiting the Acropolis, shows how deeply and persistently place can touch unconscious life. As he stood in that place with his brother, he experienced surprise, wonder, guilt, and amazement all at once. His self-analysis of this experience illuminated the powerful role of place in evoking unconscious conflict in relation to his father. Erikson and Volkan both spent a lifetime working on understanding individual and large group identity, demonstrating the power of place, both the psychosocial and geographical dimensions that shape our deepest sense of self. We live in a time marked by intense conflicts, wars, trauma related to contested geographic places. Mass migration, ecological loss, and the transformation of our places through unprecedented mobility invite psychoanalysts to listen carefully for the ways place inhabits the transference. Attending to transference to place, we help our patients locate themselves in relation to family and cultural history, and to understand the continuity and discontinuity of experience in relation to place, and to appreciate the layered and at times fragile ground on which psychic life stands. Thank you.
So I'm the moderator and commentator, and I realize that time has passed rapidly, and we only have about 18 more minutes. And either we could have a very truncated roundtable, and I would dispense with my commentary, or I give the commentary and we have no roundtable or almost no roundtable or no discussion at all. And I think I'm going to give, after thinking about it, I'm going to give you my commentary anyway. Partly because it does relate to what the films that we're going to be seeing after this is over. And I guess partly for a personal reason, this exhibition and the issues it address really resonates with me and has a deep personal meaning for me because what's documented so extensively downstairs reflects the experience of my own family and their relationship to place and their loss of their possessions. So I'm going to make my comment. So in my role as, I'll read it. In my role as commentator, I'd like to express two thoughts in response to what we've heard this afternoon. First, I'd like to offer another way to conceptualize our attachment to place and its loss that complements transference to place, which Jane presented so effectively. And second, I'd like to highlight the human tendency to idealize lost places, even when, as in the case of Vienna, after and especially before the Anschluss, those places may have been psychologically damaging or destructive. In Jane's words, transference to place is, quotes, the unconscious displacement of early relational experience onto geography, setting, and environment. Transference to place includes the repetition of psychic themes of safety, loss, and belonging enacted through our relation to the physical and cultural worlds we inhabit, unquote. Transference to place, then, is the projection of past feelings and experiences onto a place. Feelings and experiences originally related to a person or persons are transferred onto a place that then becomes identical with, or at least closely connected emotionally, to the original objects of attachment. The loss of a place to which one has a transference therefore potentially brings with it the loss, or indeed the renewed loss, of the people to whom those feelings and experiences had originally been attached. I would like to offer an additional way to conceptualize our relationship to place and to its loss, namely the concept of the self-object, originally developed by my father, the psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut. This concept is based upon an appreciation of the role that the external environment plays in shaping and maintaining the self, upon the recognition that not only in infancy but throughout our lives we are not psychologically autonomous, but remain psychologically connected to our environment, experiencing ourselves in subtle and differentiated ways as part of others and others as part of ourselves. And the environment that we experience as part of ourselves contains not only people, but places as well. The loss of a place to which one has a transference represents a repetition of the loss of the relationships with people to whom one had originally been attached and that the place has come to represent. The loss of a place that is a self-object represents a loss in and of itself. Conceptualized as a self-object, the loss of Vienna, of home and possessions for the Freuds and for so many other Jews represented the loss of places and things that were experienced as part of the self. Expropriation and exile, then, represented a loss of self. Both the concept of transference to place and of place as a self-object help us to understand our psychological attachment to places and what we experience when such places are lost, forcibly taken away, or destroyed. Both transference to place and place as a self-object help us to understand why places matter to us psychologically and what happens to us psychologically when we lose them. Whatever conceptualization one employs, and this is my second comment, our general tendency is to experience those places positively, as psychologically supportive and sustaining, particularly once those places have been lost. And yet, of course, the places to which we are attached can often be psychologically damaging or even destructive. When we think about the case of Freud, the negative aspects of place must be kept in mind. For the places that the Freud family lost were places characterized by virulent anti-Semitism and hostility towards Sigmund Freud, not only for what he thought, wrote, and did, but even more for what he was. Nevertheless, as quoted earlier by Jane, Freud, having just arrived in England, wrote to Max Eidingen, quotes, "The feeling of triumph at being freed is too strongly mingled with grief, since I have always greatly loved the prison from which I have been released." My father also lived in and grew up in the same toxically anti-Semitic environment, and yet he, like so many other Jewish refugees, did not talk or, I suspect, think about the negative, the toxic aspects of the environment he and they had lost. The exhibition Documents of Injustice shows us how the Nazis took away places and things that meant so much to the Freuds, and yet the Nazi confiscations also emerged from the same anti-Semitic Vienna to which the Freuds and many other Jews belonged and were attached. Human beings have a tendency to look back on the past nostalgically, filtering out or repressing bad experiences in order to preserve a more or less idealized past. We seek to preserve that past in order to preserve ourselves in some way, whether to stay connected to the loved ones of early life or to preserve a sense of self that is anchored in the past. But the question remains, what do we make of the fact that human beings remain psychologically attached to places that were originally psychologically damaging or destructive? Quotes, why is it, to quote Freud in Transience, quote, that this detachment of libido from its objects should be such a painful process is a mystery to us. We only see that libido clings to its objects, in the context of today's panel, to libidinally cathected places, and will not renounce those that are lost, even when a substitute lies ready to hand. Such, then, is mourning, in quotes. However one chooses to formulate it, our tendency to mourn and to idealize lost places reflects the fact that place is a part of who we are and what we are, and that we need to feel connection to psychologically important places in order to exist as human beings. So that's my comment. And I think it might be, if anyone has anything to say on the panel, but even more, you've all listened so patiently. If anyone has something to say in the audience, I think that would be great too. I think the floor is basically open for the 10 or 15 minutes that remain to us, to everyone.
Passing a mic. Yeah, there's a person in the front here.
Hello, I'm the daughter of one of the youngest psychoanalysts to leave Vienna, Elsa Pappenheim. And in her late writings that I discovered after her death, she was very active, giving oral histories and writing about her experiences. But this is so relevant. She said, and I quote, "Vienna was to me like a person."
So thank you all very much for your wonderful contributions to this very touching theme, yeah, and especially to you, Thomas, because I think it's really important to point that all the decades the Freuds had to live in Vienna was shattered by increasing anti-Semitism, and I think to be aware of that also makes the bridge from the past to the present. And everything you described, so that we have really to keep an eye on what is happening in our present.
You have anything to say?
I will. Just to thank Daniela, who gave us a tour of the exhibit here, and I want to come back tomorrow and spend more time. Deeply moving, and the quotes and the loss of place and the loss of material things, and the just the extreme amount of loss that this documents is very moving about the significance of place, and the sisters decided to stay here because whatever this place was for them, it was their place until it wasn't. Very moving.
I'll mention an object that I alluded to in my talk that Daniela and I were looking at together, an extraordinary, I think until now unpublished. Is it unpublished?
Published in a footnote
No.
in the Freud Marie Bonaparte correspondence, yeah.
But a piece of paper on Freud's London stationery with a list of his sisters' names for Marie Bonaparte, as she's making efforts, as they all are, to help them. And he lists their marital status, 3 of them widows, and each of their birthdays. And in each case, he's given the day and month of their birth. And in each case, instead of providing a date in 1860, he has written 1960, 1961, 1962. So this motif, to which he attends with great care, in extraordinary section of chapter 6 in the Traumdeutung, and this more general tendency in certain of the writings to lose track of a year, sometimes to powerfully positive effect, as in schoolboy psychology, and in other times, a state of confusion that's really disorienting. comes back at the very end of his life in this astonishing way. And it's hard to, I actually found it quite disorienting. It's hard to know what that might be interpreted to mean, the projection of his sister's birth dates into a future that none of them will ever see, but also the insistence that there's now no way, I think, to think of his sisters in anything other than the 20th century. It seems to me it's both things. If we imagine severing the 19 from the 60 is in some sense no longer a future. It's an astonishing piece of paper, and one wonders, did he leave it because he did notice it and know that it was a Fehlleistung that anyone in their situation could understand, or did he not notice it? Anyway, it's up there.
It's quite a pair of practice.
Yeah.
Austrian generations who were born after the war cannot really feel what it means to leave a place where they grew up. And in my relatives, I often experience that people in their old age want to return to places where they were happy. Whenever it was in their young years, in middle ages, and I often wondered what they were searching there. Things have changed there, but they want to see it and even to make their vacations there.
Yeah, I think, just to respond to that, two things I guess I'd like to say. The one is to respond to that. There's a universal human need to have a past to which one feels attached and to return to, and a tendency to idealize childhood, I think, in particular. I think that's something one should think about. This is not related to that, but this one thing that is just, for me, so important about this exhibition, and that is because it's the Freuds and because of the prominence of Sigmund Freud and of the family, and because of the incredible work of the team that put this exhibition together, we have before us an incredibly vivid, detailed, ultimately very human image of expropriation, confiscation, forced exile, and extermination in the case of Freud's sisters. And there's something that's really important about that, because most Jews who experience much the same thing didn't have that kind of documentation. There isn't that kind of evidence. And that in a way, for me, what's so important about this exhibition, yes, it's about Freud and the Freuds, and they're extremely important figures. He in particular is a cultural figure of great significance, an intellectual figure of great significance. But this is a kind of moment where the experience of many, many anonymous people and the suffering of many, many anonymous people, we can have a certain resonance with, a certain empathy for, a certain knowledge of. And I think, to me, that's one of the most important aspects of this exhibition.
I'm coming from a country that's based on reinvention and inventing new ideas. I'm from Illinois, and I'm happy here in Vienna. I have no intent to go back to Illinois. Could you comment a little bit on this place or places, cosmopolitan places, where I think around the world, where you could reinvent yourself, and in the US, where people could deny their past, and there's no question about it. It wasn't a sense of loss, a sense of liberation. I'm away from there, from a rural village and a new place.
That's a broad question. I don't think I could answer it, but I'm just thinking about Erikson came and tried to adapt and embraced America. And while he was in Stockbridge, was very good friends with Norman Rockwell. It's documented in Deborah Solomon's biography of Rockwell. Erikson, of course, had been a painter as a young man, and Rockwell, the illustrator. But there was sense, I think, in Erikson, I did not know him directly, but a sense in him of trying to understand this new frontier of America and being very interested in identity. Is his life work? How do you create a sense of self, either out of the past or if you don't know your paternal lineage, which he did not, he gave himself a new surname that fit. Is he his own father, Erikson? It's hard to say what was in his mind about that. But I do think I don't know if it's the place or the person or the intersection that allows some people to really reinvent themselves kind of whole cloth in some ways.
Thank you, and thank you for this wonderful palette. I think you gave us so much information that it's hard to process everything and come up with a question, but can you perhaps talk a little bit more about the connection of place and time? Because I think there's not really a sense of place. There are only places of time. Even people who leave a place on peaceful terms find very quickly that they cannot return to these places, even if they go back and visit. But there's I think a very quick imagining of a place that we have in our lives. Did Freud perhaps talk about the connection of place and time even before he was forced to leave?
So I can say something about actually the beginning of my talk, which I didn't read. I very much wanted to read a little story that's told in Lou Andreas Salome's journal about the evening conversation when Freud meets Rilke in Munich at the conference, which is the conference when Freud breaks with Jung. It couldn't be a more important event. Freud was on his way to Rome, where he was doing the last piece of research to write the extraordinary Michelangelo essay. And he apparently told a story in the voice of his son Ernst, when Ernst would have been under 3, leaving Lofrano, which of course was, as a matter of political geography in the 1890s and in 1913, the Austrian Riviera, but would very soon after Freud tells this story become Italian. So it's a site that is caught up, it will soon be caught up in the situation of the war, but is always sort of moving between nation states, and which Freud, in a sense, thinks of as Italy, or as a place of Italianness. And anyway, the story of Ernst is amazing, and Freud apparently sort of imitates his voice, and for some reason, Lou Andreas Salome writes it down. And one of the things that I would have done is connect that love of Italy as a kind of something that throughout Freud's life was used as a sort of Gleichness between Freud and Goethe, something Ferenczi remarks on. But I think that for Freud, so the South, for example, or the Acropolis, these are places that are real places, but that have a quality of unreality, or can have a quality of unreality of them related to the sort of temporal dynamics. So I think one of the lessons of Freud is that real material places really, really matter, but also lend themselves to becoming mental objects and images. So
just to add, because time is running out, but we know from the family recollections of memories that in the Freud family there was a word saying before they were leaving for vacation that they were asking, because it was the young Sophie who did so, kannst du die Reise schon sehen? Yeah. Can anybody already see the traveling? And so, yeah.
It's connected to that anecdote. It's an incredible thought. Yeah. And something she must have said also when she was very, very small.
Thank you all very much. And I hope you stay for the interviews, the screening of the interviews, because I think you'll find it relates in such a moving and concrete human way a lot of what we've been talking about, including some of the questions that have been asked and comments that have been made by you all. So thanks.